Finally, when this debate finally ends, we will have just a quick debrief at the end. So don't leave as soon as the debate is over. I'll explain more when we get there, but it's a very important part of the process. So far, are there any questions? All right. I call this debate into order. Resolved, America is a Christian nation. Please begin referring only to me as Madam Chair. We will have 4 opening speakers, 2 on each side, and then we will open it up to the general audience to also do speeches. The chair is looking for alternating speeches in the affirmative and the negative. Beginning with the affirmative, the opening speakers will get about 5 minutes. Just as a quick reminder, affirmative is agreeing with this resolution, and then negative is disagreeing with this resolution. So the chair is now looking for an opening speech in the affirmative. Yes. 5 minutes.
All right. I think this is an interesting question, and I think it's interesting because I think we're so far removed from the founding of the country that we're not seeing it clearly. America is definitely a Christian nation, and it's not a Christian nation because we have a large percentage of people that are claiming to be Christians, or based on roles, church roles, memberships. The reason why we're a Christian nation is because we were founded under Christian ideals. It's really interesting to note that 29 of the founding fathers either had a degree from a seminary or a biblical college. It formed how they looked at government and how man was supposed to govern themselves. In fact, depending on where you look, there's been analysis done that show anywhere between 30 to 70% of the founding documents have a direct linkage to Christian theology, which hints that it's a very important. The reason why I think, with my opening statement, this even is interesting is because we are so used to this being interwoven in the fabric of our society, we don't even think about it anymore. So whether or not you grew up Christian or not, you had those influences. Just like in the founding, I mentioned 29 founding fathers had those degrees. Not all of them were the same denomination. It was a wide variety. There was a lot of theists and also deists, where they believed that there was a God, but that God was not involved in everyday affairs. What's interesting, though, is that out of all of the founding fathers, none of them claimed to be an atheist. And the reason is because at that time, that was so out of the norm for society that you would actually be ostracized, which once again speaks to the outsized influence of Christianity in the founding. And from that founding, we've had lots of laws passed over time that have actually upheld, expanded the role of government and how we interact with people, but no major breaks from that. The supreme, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and while we have had amendments, the overall structure of the Constitution has stayed the same. And I would argue that is one of the reasons why we have been such a successful nation over time, is because how it was grounded. Not because Methodists are better than Lutherans or anything else of that nature. It's just a really good way to organize society. So that's the reason why I think that America is a Christian nation.
The chair is now looking for any questions for our speaker. Are there any questions for our speaker? Yes.
Madam Chair, I was just wondering if the speaker could introduce himself so we know who he is and where he's from.
Perfect.
Oh, sure. My name is Cliff Chamberlain. I'm a professor here at Dakota Wesleyan. I do not teach history, but management and marketing. So.
Perfect. All right.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for our speaker? Yes.
Madam Chairperson, I wonder if the speaker has any idea if there are other religious, world religions that also have the same religious values as Christian values, and would it be fair to say that maybe we could agree that Christianity, or that America was founded on Christian principles, but not necessarily a Christian nation? And are there other world religions that have those same values that Christian principles were found? That's Christian.
That's loaded. Because it could be answered a lot of different ways, and without getting into a real theological discussion, because I don't think this is the forum for it, I would say yes, there are definitely some characteristics that you can find universal in quite a few major religions. However, I think you will find that there are more references and instances directly to the Bible in our founding documents, and even beyond that. One of the things that I looked up is that there was about 15,000 different verses that corresponded to not only the Federalist Papers, but the Constitution and all those original writings. 15,000 verses were, you can see a direct correlation too. So that's the reason why I say it's Christian in nature, even though that might have some shared values with other world religions. I would argue that it's not just America, but it's the entire Western society is actually Christian in nature.
All right. And are there any other final questions for our speaker? Yes.
I believe the argument was based on the assumption that there's commonality and parallels between American cultural values and Christianity. Are there also fairly dramatic situations in which there's a conflict between Christian tradition and American values? And I'll use one example, which has to do with the American commitment to private property.
Speaker may answer that how you like.
I'm not aware of the argument that you're
Clarification.
questioner,
Clarification.
we call him the questioner, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sure. I'm not aware of the argument the questioner is actually putting forward, so I can't speak to it. I don't know. Do you have another example that maybe I can?
Well, I picked the example of private property because anyone looking at the American culture would be ought to be aware of the fact that commitment to private property rights is a very important value in the American culture. My reading of the biblical tradition is that it's not so important, that it's a secondary value. And therefore, we have situations that are not only where the Christian story and the American story share things, but do we not also have situations where the Christian story and the American story diverge, and that there's a constant, at least a dialogue and maybe a degree of hostility between the two stories.
Okay. I think to answer that question, it's very simple. When we talk about Christian in nature, okay, or when I do, what I'm referring to is the overarching themes. There are a ton. I don't even know how many different denominations there are in the world. I'm a Baptist, and I think there's at least 40 different types of Baptists. There's just such a myriad of differences, and they're ranging all over. okay? So it's hard to point out different things and say, well, we as American Christians should follow this pattern, because even if you look at, Methodists and Lutherans and Baptists, for instance, there's wild disparities between us. To answer your question about private property, it really depends on how you actually look at it. If you're referring to like Acts, where the early church sold all their possessions and they lived in common and all of that, that's great. However, I don't think it actually makes your case, simply because they did have possessions and they did sell them, and then they took the proceeds of those transactions and they used them in accordance with their beliefs. Not that it was given to somebody else to handle or to administer, but they collectively did it. So I don't think that is a direct parallel with the American ideal of private property.
All right, and with that, our speaker is thanked. All right, the chair is now looking for an opening speech in the negative. You will get about 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, may I read my remarks?
Yes, of course.
I don't need a mic. Can you folks hear me okay?
We just need it for the live video, since we're recording.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is going to be a little bit awkward as I turn my pages here, but I'll try to make it as smooth as possible. My name is Sean Flynn. I'm a professor of history at Dakota Wesleyan University. Braver angels have asked us to address the question, is America a Christian nation? That's a timely question, especially at a moment when factions within the evangelical Protestant community, within my own faith community of Catholicism, and within the Republican Party yearn to impose a Christian agenda on the nation. The faction leaders routinely pervert history to make the case that the true, authentic American nation was founded by Christians for Christians, that America's alleged faults are the consequence of our historical ignorance of the alleged Christian principles upon which the founders brought forth a nation. I would make the case that the founders did not conceive of America as a Christian nation, and that the U.S. Constitution was not designed to form a Christian nation nor foster a Christian nationalism. On the contrary, our Constitution was designed to thwart Christian nationalism. I do not deny that Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Madison, and Hamilton were affected by the Protestant culture of their age. I do not deny that a kind of Puritan moralism colored their thoughts, nor do I deny that these men felt that a providence had set America apart for a special purpose. I assert, however, and the historical record supports this assertion, that the founders were most decidedly not Christian nationalists. They were the antithesis of Christian nationalists. Excuse me. I do. For as much as they were shaped by colonial Protestantism, the founders were transformed by the most potent secular movement of modern Western history, the Enlightenment, a revolutionary intellectual movement that elevated science and reason to unprecedented levels of influence. If not outright heretics, men like Franklin and Jefferson would develop unorthodox religious views that would shock today's Christian nationalists. As children of the Enlightenment, the framers were religious skeptics, skeptical about organized religion and skeptical of politicized clergymen. Some were skeptical about Christ's divinity, and most were skeptical of emotional Christians. They were fierce Republicans, small r Republicans, who associated national religion with tyranny. Persecuted Puritans and Catholics, after all, had escaped a national religion in England and fled to America. In the minds of the founders, any combination of church and state produced an unholy alliance that violated the religious conscience of its citizenry. Enlightened thinkers like Locke and Voltaire taught them that men cannot be forced to be saved, that they must be left to their individual consciences. That since individuals have no right to interfere in the religious beliefs of others, governments don't either. No church or church member was entitled to exercise legislative or judicial powers that were reserved to the states. Voltaire's oft-quoted maxim, quote, "If there was only one religion in England, there would be danger of despotism. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness," impressed the minds of the founders, who were far more progressive in their attitudes toward non-Christian religions than we are. Jefferson reminds us that it was the Romans, a pagan people, whose commitment to freedom of conscience nurtured religious movements. "For had not the Roman government permitted free inquiry," Jefferson wrote, "Christianity could never have been introduced," unquote. Madison contended that it was the citizens' duty to prevent the establishment of Christianity to the exclusion of other religions. Jefferson emphasized that the Virginia legislature, in debating a bill to protect religious freedom, barred the insertion of the name Jesus Christ in the legislation. That the insertion was rejected by a great majority, Jefferson wrote, is proof that they meant to comprehend, within the mantle of its protection, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination, unquote. Jefferson's position was echoed by Theophilus Parsons of Massachusetts, who rebuffed the idea that only Christians could hold public office. Oaths recited on a Bible, Parsons noted, would be no barrier to unprincipled men. As Pauline Meyer has observed, Americans of the founding period, sorry for these awkward moments, everyone. Americans of the founding period understood freedom of conscience in a way that would still be considered radical today. In the state ratifying convention, some clergymen, Christian clergymen, argued for allowing Jews, Catholics, and Muslims to be eligible for public office against a broad popular conviction that religious freedom was safest in the hands of Protestants. James Iredell of North Carolina concluded that America has set an example to mankind, that a man may be of different religious sentiments from our own without being a bad member of society. It was opinions like these that explain why the framers of the Constitution, in Article 6, agreed to the following, quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," unquote. America is not a Christian nation, nor was it ever intended to become one. The Constitution founded a secular state wherein, in Jefferson's words, there are equal opportunities for all and special privileges for none. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions for our speaker? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, Madam Chairperson, I was wondering if the speaker could help me better understand the difference, nuances of Christian nation and Christian nationalism.
Yeah, Christian nationalism is the idea that Christian values, Christian principles, Christian doctrines should be integrated into the body politic, and that the body politic should be founded on these principles and these values. And that the reason you should do that is because the framers and the founders of the government intended it to be that way. They never make clear historical arguments for that, but they claim that since the document, the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, was founded on Christian principles, that we are bound by those documents, which are founding documents, to establish a Christian principle, a Christian body politic, a Christian value system, that it should integrate and be part of the integral part of our political system. And I would argue that that's not what Madison and Franklin, Washington, Jefferson had in mind at all.
All right. Are there any other questions for our speaker? Yes.
Madam Chair, I'm wondering if the speaker could tell us in his reading of primary documents like the Federalist Papers and whatnot, are there a lot of biblical references? Do you come across passages where you can see, well, he's got Micah 6:8 in mind, or
not in
like
the Federalist Papers? No, not in the Federalist Papers. There are not. By the way, Alexander Hamilton, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, was asked why God the name God, the word God was not inserted into the Constitution, to which Alexander Hamilton replied, "We forgot," unquote. It just was not a concern for the framers of the Constitution. They were founding a secular state in which religious freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience could be practiced in all of its forms, and that there would be no established religion. The First Amendment of the Constitution has 2 religious clauses. No established religion, that there is no religion that is above any other religion, and freedom of conscience cannot be infringed upon or invaded by the state. So you're not going to find it in the Federalist Papers, nor are you going to find it. Madison and Thomas Jefferson were critical figures in the development of the Virginia Bill of Rights, and the Virginia Bill of Rights had an enormous influence on the U.S. Bill of Rights. And neither of those men wanted any kind of religious tests of office, any mention of religion. The quote I talk about do not mention Jesus Christ. Yes, God is mentioned, the Creator is mentioned. As Cliff pointed out, deists were not atheists, right? None of these men were atheists, not even Thomas Jefferson. Some of you might know about Thomas Jefferson's Bible. He redacted every miracle in it. He took a razor, and any miracle that was referenced in the Old or New Testament, he just took it out. Why? Because there's no scientific proof for the resurrection. There's no scientific proof you can turn water into wine. There's no scientific proof that you can make a blind man see, a deaf man hear, a mute man talk. There's no scientific evidence for that. It could not have happened. These were hardcore enlightened thinkers who really worried about the infringement on people's rights of a state religion. You have to understand, they had experienced the persecution, or their forefathers had experienced the persecution that Christians were suffering under in England. Huguenots, French Huguenots, persecuted by the Catholic Church, had fled to America. The last thing they wanted was a state religion, a nation state, a Christian nation, which would invade people's consciences.
Any final questions for our speaker before we move on? Yes.
I would be Madam Chair, I would be curious to hear the second half of the previous question on what's the definition of a Christian nation. We heard what a Christian nationalist is. I'd like to hear a Christian nation definition.
Yeah, the chair smiles on any discussion about, the definition of what a Christian nation is, what constitutes a Christian nation. So,
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've made this argument from the point of view of Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalists, who are now part of our body politic in a way that we've not seen in my lifetime, are demanding that the United States return to its roots as a Christian nation. I'm not sure how I would define the difference between the two, which is not a good answer. Do you have a particular perspective on that? Yeah. I think I'm on pretty solid ground here that Christian nationalists are arguing for a return to an authentic America. And the authentic America is one that was founded by Christians for Christians to live out, to realize this mission that Americans had, the shining city on a hill, to fulfill the Christian mission in America. And certainly Puritans believed that. But Puritans are getting outshouted. By the way, if you look at the primary documents, and you go to every state had to ratify the Constitution. So you have ratifying conventions in all the states. Who's getting shouted down? The Puritans. In very nice language, people are telling them to sit down and shut up. We're not going to form a Puritan state. We tried that. It led to 20 people being executed in Salem. It led to people being persecuted horribly in Puritan life. And the Americans were not going to go down that road of a Christian nation the way Puritans were defining it. And John Adams, by the way, was a good Puritan. John Adams was. John Adams was struck by the atheism of the French Revolution. It was an atheistic revolution, which, by the way, it was.
Right, and with that, our speaker is thanked. The chair is now looking for another opening speech in the affirmative. Here we are. You will get about 5 minutes.
All right, I'm Jeff Pospisil. I'm a CPA, so I'm not from the history side, so I'm going to talk about something a little different. So I'm going to start with a little story. I came from Montana and I went to North Dakota, and when I went to North Dakota, we could tell where anybody was from by having them say the word about. It wasn't too hard. And all of a sudden, about halfway through my first semester in Jamestown, North Dakota, all of a sudden I became a Dakotan and couldn't say about correctly anymore. So anyway, the part of the reason I say this is we've become so enmeshed in Christianity that I don't even think it's easy to tell that if we are a Christian nation or not. So I would think to myself, okay, what would I expect if I were to visit a Christian nation? I could look at their founding, but you look at it, I mean, of course the Vatican is a Christian nation, right? But there's a lot of other ones. Norway, the UK, they all have an official religion, and it's Christianity. You look at a number of these ones that you'd say, okay, we're more religious than the UK, and they are an official Christian nation. So I started thinking to myself, okay, what would I look at? What about the holidays? The holidays are coming up. Do they celebrate major Christian holidays? Christmas is a time when everybody can tell it's Christmas, right? The whole population celebrates it. The country shuts down. That's a sign that maybe we are in a Christian nation. A Christian nation would celebrate Christian holidays. Another thing that I would look at is, what about the leaders? We're coming up on an election. Have we ever had a Christian leader say, I'm an atheist, I don't believe, or I'm a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist, I'm anything else? I remember back about a decade ago when people were trying to criticize President Obama, and they claimed he was a Muslim. And that was a very bad thing, at least at that time, where all of a sudden everybody came to his defense and said, no, he goes to a church. Not everybody, but the Democratic Party came to his defense and said, no, he's a Christian. So, and probably normal thinking people also said that as well. I start thinking about, okay, what else would I expect? As an accountant, would it be so much that it would actually infiltrate our tax laws, that we're so Christian that it's even in the Internal Revenue Code? And the answer is yes. If you look at Section 107 of the Internal Revenue Code, it says if you are a minister of the gospel, you get special tax treatment. And it says minister of the gospel. It doesn't say religious person, whatever. It doesn't say anything like that. It says in... Okay, I just visited with a pastor today, actually right before I came here, wants to start up a ministry. I told him, you don't want to start up a separate ministry, you want to start it up as part of your church. Why? Because churches get special tax treatment where you don't have to jump through all the hoops to become a 501c3 to receive charitable contributions. They are the only ones. It says churches there, religious associations. It doesn't say mosques. It doesn't say anything like that. It says churches. So we are just so intermeshed with all of Christian ideals and perspective that I don't think we even see it. If we were to go to a different country, if you were to go to China in December, you probably won't see Christmas decorations. You won't see their president claiming to be a Christian. You won't see it in their tax code that Christians get special treatment. So that's why I believe we are a Christian nation.
All right. The chair is now looking for questions for our speaker. Yes, right over here. And then we'll go to you. Oh, well, okay, we'll start with her and then we'll go over here.
Madam Chairman, I would like to know if the speaker could respond to how things might be done in other parts of the country. For example, I lived in Virginia for 13 years, and we had a number of religions that were recognized, and for our holidays we would pick one that pertained to the faith that we had. For example, if someone was Jewish, they could choose to have a vacation on Hanukkah or Tu B'Shvat or whichever holiday they felt was most meaningful for them, and they would get the day off. And in New York State, where I taught, we actually had 12 religious holidays throughout the year, and it encompassed the major religions that were found in New York State.
Yeah, I guess as far as that, there will be differences. I see differences all over where people might recognize different ones. Like here, we get Good Friday off and Easter Monday sometimes. I know that was in North Dakota. I don't remember if that's in South Dakota. It's different from place to place, but as a nation, the only religious holiday that we have as a federal holiday is Christmas. Everything else is more of a patriotic day, or like Labor Day or Memorial Day, something like that. So I don't necessarily see a contradiction that they allow other ones. I would wonder if the majority of people are taking a Christian holiday versus any of the other holidays might be other evidence that maybe we are a Christian nation. So.
Interesting. All right, and one more question over here.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I would be surprised if our tax code, when it says church, doesn't apply to a Hindu church or any religion in the United States. But I know very little about the tax code. But
And I had the question from a Muslim, actually, is why I brought that up. A Muslim brought it up and asked, does this apply? And I did my research, and there's nothing in the IRS guidance. The IRS hates to take a clear position, but in the code it does say church, and it does say religious association. But so there might be wiggle room, but at least it says this specifically church and minister of the gospel. So those are the two words that I found evident.
Any final questions for our speaker? Yes, right here.
Madam Chair, I would wonder if the speaker considers the fact that any Christian nation would therefore consider somebody who was Muslim capable of holding a public office. It's totally unacceptable in your reference to our previous President Obama. But it became acceptable as soon as it was clarified that he was Christian. And I would wonder if the Christian values would then equate not accepting Muslim, but waiting until he was confirmed Christian.
Yeah, that's interesting. I kind of wondered about that because Mitt Romney also, when he ran for president, wasn't a typical Christian. Most Protestants wouldn't consider him a Christian either. And I don't know if I have an opinion on that. I know, I'm just trying to think about, I just think the fact that our leaders try to set themselves to be Christian is more what I was thinking of when I thought about this thing. You would want the leaders to present themselves as Christian, to try to back their own Christian credentials in order to be elected. That's seen as a positive for them to be elected, versus if somebody was going to say, no, I'm a Muslim. If President Obama would have embraced the Muslim identity, how would that have affected the election? I guess I don't know for sure, but I think it might have made it a little more difficult. So.
All right, the chair thanks our speaker. The chair is now looking for another last opening speech in the negative. You will get about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to come at this with perhaps a little different angle, and many of you know that I'm a biblical scholar and teach biblical studies, and so of course I'm going to think about it in those terms. But one of the things that would be required if our nation was truly a Christian nation would be that we would be somehow connected to the living intentions of the historical Christ, right? We would have to be, if we're a Christian nation, we'd have to be somehow connected to the intentions of Jesus. And the fact is, if Jesus wasn't about starting a nation, and we're claimed to be a nation, there's just such a lack of integrity there in the sense of being meaningfully committed to our foundation. And it seems to me that in several instances, Jesus makes very, very clear that he's not interested in nation building. And John's gospel is the clearest on this. And so Jesus, when he's being charged by Pilate of the possibility of being involved in insurrection, clearly that's what Pilate's concerned about. And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then I would have my troops come and fight for me," or something to that effect. "But my kingdom is from a different place." And that seems to be such a clear statement, and it's obvious that Pilate was taking it this way, that Jesus' kingdom was spiritual and not an actual practical, or not practical, a political, earthly kingdom, because Pilate a moment later says, "I have no problem with this man." In other words, if Pilate had any kind of inkling that Jesus was actually about starting a political state, then Pilate would be very concerned, because it would be an immediate threat to him and the Roman state. And so Pilate makes clear that he understands Jesus to be saying exactly what Jesus says when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." So I just don't understand how any nation can be a Christian nation if Jesus wasn't about founding nations. And so that's the first thought. The second thought I have is that there seems to be a real fundamental disconnect between the theology of the Apostle Paul and nation building. Paul clearly has an understanding of salvation being based on, it's like my faith in Christ forgives me of my past sins, but it also, in that I take up my cross to follow, in that place of being in Christ and following Christ, that your agenda for the future is set, and now a true Christian life is a cruciform life. And in other words, how do you identify a Christian but a person that, because of their gratitude for what God has done to forgive them of their previous sins, they're driven to live a life of sacrificial love toward others so that they can live this Jesus model out. Jesus is a perfect model of one who sacrificed his life for others and didn't impose. So Christ was clearly not imposing on others, but was sacrificing himself for others. And so Paul's understanding of the Christian life is that of deep self-sacrifice for others in the Jesus model. And that's what he means when he says that we are crucified with Christ, or that we have the mind of Christ. He's thinking of living a life of self-sacrificial love based on the Jesus model. And I don't know how a nation does that. How can a nation do that kind of thing, which is fundamental? Well, even more simply, how could a nation take up its cross to follow Jesus? A nation can't do that. Individuals can do that. Maybe even organizations can do that. Let's say you've got a Christian nonprofit and people are really sacrificing and giving sacrificially to the nonprofit to help people that are in need. That fits the Jesus model, doesn't it? But what does a nation do? A nation can't fit that model. So I think the whole notion of a Christian nation, Christianity doesn't fit on the national level. And thirdly, it seems to me like there's just a fundamental disconnect, because the Christian documents say nothing, or the biblical documents, I should say nothing about presidency or Congress or having a standing army or a Bill of Rights. They're just not there. You have kings and laws, but they're ancient legal systems. They're not modern legal systems at all. And so it seems like on all these different levels, there's just a fundamental disconnect between Christianity and a nation of any type. And so I would submit to you that America is not a Christian nation.
Are there any questions for our speaker? Any questions for our speaker? Yes.
I would like to have you have the speaker reflect on the question, in what way should Christians, either individually or collectively, seek to impact the body politic? The story that I hear from the speaker is that there's a disconnect here, that Christianity is a personalized situation, and then there's this political process over here that's different.
Yeah.
As a person deeply rooted in the social gospel myself,
Right.
my reaction is there's more room for individual impacting of the body politic than is allowed for that.
Well, I'm a social gospel guy too, so we can connect on that point. But no, I think that there's a distinction we can make between America being a Christian nation or America having a lot of Christians in it that are going to be very involved and use their ethical perspective to guide them. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. And the way I would say it is America's not a Christian nation, but America is a successful democracy. It's definitely that has a strong Christian presence. And because we have such a strong Christian presence, that shapes our destiny and our calling. And so I'm very comfortable with that language, right? That we're a secular, we are a secular nation, but I would prefer to say we're a successful democracy with a strong Christian presence. And because we have a strong Christian presence, and a lot of people that have a Christian ideal and are seeking after a Christian ethic, that should shape who we are, our kind of national destiny. And I'm comfortable with that. And yeah, so.
Any other questions for our speaker? Any other questions for our speaker? The chair actually has a question for a speaker. So just for clarification, does the speaker posit that Christian nations technically may exist, or at least they can claim to exist, but that it can't be backed up theologically?
Yeah, it seems to me like any notion of Christian nation, while groups may claim to be that there's a disconnect between those claims and what Christianity is about as a religion. Yeah. So.
Any final questions for a speaker? Yes.
Madam Chair, I'll ask the speaker the same question I asked before. How would he understand the difference between a Christian nation and Christian nationalism?
Let's see if I can tease that out. So a Christian nation, which I don't really believe exists, so it's like describing a unicorn almost. So a Christian nation, if a group claims to be a Christian nation, maybe the only way I can do this really, because I don't believe there is a Christian nation, and that I don't believe there ever has been. So it's a little hard for me to define what a Christian nation is, because I only believe that it isn't. So I don't really even know how to define it. So what Christian nationalism is, the belief that we are, in our founding, have a Christian identity, and that our laws are somehow connected to biblical laws, and that in order to be successful as a nation, we have to be faithful to our founding, which is based on biblical and theological laws. That's the way I would define a Christian nation, a Christian nationalist. It's that belief. So.
And with that, our speaker is thanked. So now that the opening speeches are over, we'll be opening up the stage to any and all members of the audience to do their own speeches. Just raise your hand and I'll call you out. And remember, it's okay to not have been prepared. An impromptu speech is just as appreciated. And I would also quickly like to introduce a Braver Angels concept known as speech on the topic. So if you feel a little bit daunted by the task of making a speech solely on the affirmative or solely on the negative, and you feel like you want to introduce some nuance or just some information, you could do a speech on the topic. So with that in mind, the chair is looking for a speech in the affirmative or a speech on the topic. Yes. And you will get about 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'll call this a speech on the topic. Yeah, to me, what does that mean? Well, it kind of depends. Certainly, we have a majority Christian population. We have long Christian traditions. We're at a university that has a long Christian tradition and is one of many such universities that go back to before we were a nation. We had Christian universities, Christian education. So in that sense, you could say, well, we're a Christian nation. We have lots of people with Christian characteristics. And as far as like the politics got brought up in President Obama and people saying he was a Muslim and that was a detriment. And so you could say the views of individual Christians have a big impact on what happens politically, because people vote. And I would certainly say people can be motivated by whatever religious views they want to be in voting and promoting issues and joining political organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the freedom we have under the Constitution. Okay? The Constitution does allow us, because there is no establishment of a religion, to do that. And I think sometimes part of the reason this is probably an interesting question is because there's this tension between the rights we all have to promote our religious views and live them out however we want to, and what's going to be, how the country's going to be governed. Because you're right, it's at the national level, we don't have non-Christian presidents. We have a lot of politicians at local levels, but that's based on the local politics, right? Ilhan Omar is in a district that's got a lot of Muslims, so she's got political support, even though she's not a Christian. And there are places that will have have Jewish politicians because they have a lot of Jews there, okay? Native American politicians in Native American areas. So I think, if I have a concern here, it's that we kind of we conflate these things. The fact of all these traditions and the current demographics, et cetera, with what, quote, should happen with our governing institutions. So in that sense, I'm a con on this. If we're talking about the government has to be guided by Christian principles, I would say no. And I would echo what Dr. Flynn said as far as there's a lot of other influences on the founders other than Christianity. There's the Enlightenment, and I'm a math guy, so I have to plug in for Euclid. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's basically goes back to Euclid's geometry, where you put out your axioms, and then you deduce what comes from that once you agree on the self-evident axioms. So that's kind of my probably more than 3 minutes worth of...
No, you're all right.
Okay.
All right.
I'll stay here if there's any questions.
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions for our speaker? Any questions for our speaker? The chair actually has a question for our speaker. So the speaker says that we shouldn't have Christianity, I guess, governing the laws. So there's kind of a Christian duty in some sense to promote Christianity. So how do you reason that with the fact that our nation shouldn't be governed by Christian laws, so to speak?
That's a good question, and it's an inherent tension, I think. And traditionally, the courts have had some role in this, in saying if a local jurisdiction does pass a law that is too explicitly promoting Christianity, it's the job of the courts to strike that down. And I'll just allude to an issue. We haven't heard a lot about evolution wars lately, but back about 20 years ago, Dover, Pennsylvania, the school board instigated a biology curriculum that was tied to a Christian tradition and was anti-evolutionary in some sense, and the court ruled against that. And part of it was not just the nature of the curriculum, but evidence of the motivation of the people who instituted that they wanted to basically impose Christianity on the schools. And that can be tricky because we talked a little bit about commonality of values, and that a lot of different religious traditions could be seen as having values consistent with what we have. And so the Establishment Clause 1, I forget the name of it, but one of the interpretive doctrines of Supreme Court is if a law has the either effect or intention of promoting a religious view, then it's unconstitutional. And certainly it's harder to get to the intent, but if it has the effect, that can be good enough to rule a law unconstitutional, even if it was kind of sideways had that effect. So I think that what I'd say is the courts would have a role in sort of monitoring the extent to which a majority, Christian majority, would be imposing their views in an inappropriate, unconstitutional manner.
Any other questions for our speaker? Any questions for our speaker? All right, and with that, our speaker is... Oh, we have a question right here. Okay, perfect. And did you raise your hand too? Okay.
Does the government have a responsibility to protect the religion and the rights of people who might have a diverse religion?
I would say absolutely. That's First Amendment.
Any final questions for our speaker before we move on? All right, and with that, our speaker is thanked. Okay, so now the chair is looking for a speech in the negative or a speech on the topic. Yes? And you will get about 3 to 4 minutes.
What does it mean to be a Christian nation? I think most people have different answers to this question. To some, a Christian nation is governed by Christian-based laws and concepts, while to others, it might simply mean a country where the majority of people identify as Christian. To me, the answer lies within our founders' intent. When they created this country, they did so with the deliberate goal of ensuring that the government not be tied to any one religion, even if the majority of its citizens shared the same faith. Though the Founding Fathers are men of faith themselves, they were also deeply familiar with the dangers of state-controlled religion. Many had come from Europe, where the intertwining of church and state had led to centuries of persecution, religious wars, and oppression. They wanted something different for America, a nation where people could practice their religion freely. This is why, in the first words of the First Amendment of the Constitution, they declared that Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is not a call to create a Christian nation, but rather a promise of religious liberty for everyone, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others. It was a radical and revolutionary idea at the time, a government that would not endorse or enforce any particular religious doctrine. This idea is also echoed in the U.S. Treaty with Tripoli in 1797, where it stated that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So, is America a Christian nation? I would argue no. But should it be? To this, I would again argue no. If America were a Christian nation, in the legal sense, it would mean that our laws would be based on Christian theology, and non-Christians might find themselves subject to rules that conflict with their own beliefs. This would undermine the core of our democratic principles. Principles are meant to protect individual freedom and ensure equality for all citizens, not just those of one faith. We also have to ask whose version of Christianity would dominate in a so-called Christian nation. Christianity is not a monolith. It includes a vast range of beliefs and practices, from evangelical to mainline denominations, each with their own interpretations of Christian teachings. To govern based on one interpretation would inevitably exclude others, even among Christians themselves. This might lead to an erosion of the unity we strive for as a diverse nation. Now, I do not deny the influence Christianity has had on American culture. Christian values such as compassion, charity, and the importance of community have certainly shaped our society in many ways. But these are not values exclusive to Christianity. They are shared across many different faiths and philosophies. And in fact, America's commitment to justice, equality, and the protection of human rights is rooted in not any one religion, but in Enlightenment ideals that influenced the founding of this country. Ideals based on reason, equality, and the belief in the inherent dignity of every human being. Ultimately, America is not and should not be defined by any single religion, in my opinion. It is defined by its commitment to freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and most importantly, freedom of religion. And that's my opinion.
Right. Are there any questions for our speaker? Any questions for our speaker? Yes.
Madam Chair, is the speaker a student here? Sorry.
I'm a student at MTI.
MTI, okay. Maybe this is going for this, right now Madam Chair, being in a Wesleyan university, is the speaker aware of, this is a Christian college with a specific denomination, would the speaker be aware of any way that non-Methodists are treated poorly or infringed on their rights here at this university?
I need to think about that more.
Any other questions for our speaker? Yes.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker.
Move the mic a little bit closer.
I would like to ask the speaker, even though some of the founding fathers were somewhat religious, does the speaker think they just put their biases aside when forming the Constitution?
Yeah. I think it's hard to put your biases aside completely, but I think they did try to be as objective as possible.
Are there any other final questions for a speaker? Yes, ma'am.
Madam Chair, I think what I want to say is more of an affirmation of something the speaker said. She brought out for the first time this evening that America is a culturally Christian, and I would affirm that, and I appreciated her saying that.
So would the speaker affirm that America is culturally Christian?
Yes, I agree with that.
All right. And with that, our speaker is thanked. So the chair is now looking for a speech in the affirmative or a speech on the topic. Are there anyone who wants to speak either on the affirmative or on the topic? We could have some discussion also on the definition of Christian nation, since we kind of touched on that. So if there's anyone that's willing, a speech in the affirmative or a speech on the topic? Yes.
On
if
the
you could stand here
topic-
in the center, please. Thank you.
On the topic of us being a Christian nation, I have quite a few questions and concerns about if we are a Christian nation. How does one justify how people are treated at the border? How do people justify the for example, the January 6th, the violence, because a Christian, Christ with an IAN, means a follower of Christ. And if people are following Christ, then they are espousing the ideals and live as if they were following Christ's teachings. And it's hard for my own self to explain or justify the United States as being a Christian nation in the absence of concrete examples of how it is that we're Christian.
Are there any questions for our speaker? Any questions for our speaker? The chair actually has a question for the speaker. So does the speaker think that, unlike some of the other speakers have said, that America may not actually be a culturally Christian nation?
Well, the reason for my own confusion is because I don't see the evidence of us really being a true Christian nation in how we see that people who claim that they are Christian don't always appear to be following the teachings of Christ, and it confuses and disturbs me.
All right. Are there any other questions for a speaker? Any questions? Yes. Right behind you.
That's a good, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair. I would say the speaker makes some very good points. And in thinking about that, any big group, it's hard for the big group to act in an entirely consistent manner with itself, is one problem. But I think you could maybe point to some actions.
This sounds like it could potentially be a speech. Do you want to go ahead and form it into a speech?
I don't want to do a whole nother speech. I just wanted to maybe suggest something that might address the example you're looking for would be cases where the United States, and this is a military thing too, which you might say is inconsistent with Christianity, but we have fought to help preserve the rights of other countries, for the people in other countries to be able to live their lives the way they would see fit, including having religious freedom. You know, in keeping, for example, nations free from Nazism, or currently trying to help Ukraine maintain its freedom from Russia. In a sense, if we're protecting people's freedom of religion in other countries, we might be seen as acting in a Christian way.
And could you form that into a question for her, for our speaker?
I guess my question would be, would the speaker agree that that might possibly be an example that addresses her concern?
I think people like to think that they are acting in Christian manners, but sometimes really don't consider what is really required to be Christian.
Okay. Are there any other final questions for our speaker? Yes.
It seems to me that one of the problems we haven't addressed, and I think you're speaking partly to it, is that we've used the word Christian as if there were some collection of behavior, ideas, whatever, about which we all agree. As one who has a very unorthodox theological point of view, I would suggest that's very far from the truth. And that the notion that we could somehow find a common core of, quote, Christianity, unquote, that defines this nation is, I think, my own view is it's bound is bound to fail. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be in the game telling our part of the story, but the notion that we all agree on what that story is does not seem to me to be in accord with reality.
And could you form this into a question for our speaker?
Well, the question is whether that perspective speaks to the concern you raised.
The speaker might raise.
I think that's part of the issue. My own core beliefs believe that the nation was not intended to be Christian by design. For example, if you take what the Statue of Liberty, what is written on there, give us your huddled masses yearning to be free. I think that's the common element that would describe most Americans, but we don't always agree what freedom is. And sometimes we don't want to accept the wild diversity that exists in this nation. But I think it's my own philosophy is that it's absolutely necessary for us to be accepting of people of a wide variety of cultures and ways of living and ways of thinking and ways of worshiping in order for us to get along.
All right, and with that, our speaker is thanked. So the chair is looking for a speech now in the negative or on the topic. Does anyone want to do a speech? Yes.
You'll have to forgive me. I haven't given a speech at all since like 2021.
The chair smiles upon any impromptu speech, prepared or unprepared.
Sorry. So, something, I don't know, the way I've thought about this, America wasn't founded to be Christian. I mean, America itself, there's a reason why we have in our First Amendment freedom of religion. Because otherwise it would be freedom of religion as long as it's Christian and you believe in God and Jesus. It was never intended to be a Christian nation, but when you have so many people who are Christian, so many people who take those values and incorporate them into government, people can make the argument that America is a Christian nation because, simply put, America has those ideals. I mean, I'm young, I'm only 20, so it's like I've seen so many debates with candidates, people in offices, people in positions of power. I mean, we've had such big events that have been decided by people taking their values and applying them at a national level. I'm just thinking like Roe v. Wade. I'm not going to get on that topic because I don't want to delve into that, but knowing that that was partially decided, if not extremely decided by people taking their religion and deciding that that was their moral obligation, it was moral and just to impose something just because their religious stance said so. What I'm saying is, you can make the argument that America isn't religious. It was only within the last couple of years that Americans, at least half of Americans don't have a religion or consider themselves agnostic nowadays. But when you have people in positions of power who by far still have those core beliefs, America, in a sense, is a Christian nation due to that. What I'm saying, I don't know. What I'm saying is, you can make the argument one way or the other. Most American citizens nowadays don't have a belief. But on the other hand, the people that are in power tend to have that belief. And when that influences law and just daily events, you can just make the connection between the two.
And then, are there any questions for our speaker? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Eli, for your eloquence. Eli, in the state...
The speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the state of Oklahoma, legislators in the state of Oklahoma, who probably fit your depiction of legislators who bring their Christian views into the body, representative bodies like that, want to impose school prayer in public schools in Oklahoma, which as a Catholic offends me. I'm curious, what is your position on...
What is the speaker's?
What is the speaker's position on that, or what is your reaction to a state government wanting to impose in public schools school prayer?
Thank you. Well, I personally think that's going against the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and forcing someone to do something that follows a religious code is already right there. It's violating someone's religion. If they don't have a religion, you're imposing one onto them. If they have a different religion, you're imposing your beliefs onto them. So when you change or when you force practices that are inherently religious on people, it does violate that whole stance. It ends up making government, at least in that action, religious.
Are there any other questions for our speaker? Any other questions for our speaker? Okay, we're going to go right here and then right here.
Madam Chair, could you ask about the difference between the religious side of what we just talked about, of forcing people to do the Constitution or the pledge, and the difference between the two, because I think it's fundamental.
Okay. So, can I get clarification on that?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding it
Yep,
absolutely
of course.
correct.
Clarification.
I see the issue different than forcing a religion. I see the flag, I see that presentation that we used to make all the time, and when I was young, and we do it many times before the council meeting, whatnot else. But I don't like forced issues, but I don't like to exclude issues that are not coached in religion, which I think we're talking two different sides.
So, if I think I'm understanding what you're getting at with, like, are you talking about, like, the pledge, like Pledge of Allegiance almost? So, I mean, I still had to do that in high school. So I still remember all the words, how to do it. I feel there's a difference between something like that, which is meant to invoke patriotism, meant to help spark someone to feel proud for their country, and then difference having like the Ten Commandments or a prayer in school. With one, it's a nationalistic thing. You're trying to foster a sense of, you know, national culture and just patriotism, as I've been saying. Whereas the other one, you're trying to use religious values that someone has on someone else, trying to get them to repeat them, trying to get them to use them, or even potentially switch to them and or go and take their morals and instead take yours. I don't know. Religion and requiring something in school, they can both happen, but at that point it feels like government's forcing it on something.
And then our final question right here.
Madam Chair, I wonder if the speaker would be more comfortable or would be comfortable with a moment of silence instead of prayer in school.
That is a very good question. A moment of silence in exactly what way? I would appreciate getting that defined.
Need for clarification?
I think it's just a moment of silence to offer any religious practice or non-religious practice to acknowledge their God or their higher being.
Well, something like that would be open-ended. It wouldn't infringe upon someone's religious values, because if you have them, say you're a Muslim or you're a Christian, you can have two kids like that, and they can each do their own separate prayer as long as they, know their prayer. And kids without a religion don't have to participate at all, where you can even get other religions where there's not a set prayer, where it's more a belief or thanking. The way it sounds, having a moment of silence that allows a student to decide what they're going to be praying to or what they're believing in would absolutely keep the First Amendment freedom of religion. You don't have to participate, but if you do, you can keep it to yourself.
And with that, our speaker is thanked. Since we are running a little bit short on time, we're going to be moving to our debrief in a moment here, but I just wanted to make a couple comments. When I came to this debate, I was very curious as to what would be discussed. I wondered how Christian would be defined. I wondered how America would be defined. I wondered how nation would be defined. I wondered how is would be defined. And I realized that it seems to me that there is room for discussion on whether America is / should be Christian nation by law or by culture. So I found that to be very interesting. And so I've learned a lot. I have a lot to be thinking about now, and I will be writing in my journal a lot tonight. So we will be moving on to our debrief, but firstly, again, thank you for everything. I will now ask permission to adjourn the debate and move on to the debrief. Do I have a motion to adjourn? A second? Thank you. Without any objection, the debate is adjourned. You can begin calling me by name now and addressing each other. Feel free to tell everyone around you your bottled up insults. So after Braver Angel debates, we do a debrief, and how this works is very, very simple. It's just you tell us briefly about what you learned or any lingering thoughts, comments about the debate, and maybe just some comments about me as a chair. So what did you learn, what did you enjoy, and what can we do to improve? This room is pretty small, so just go ahead and shout it out. What did you learn, what did you enjoy, and what can we do to improve? Yes. Thank you. Yeah. What did you learn? What did you enjoy? What can we do to improve? What did you learn? What did you enjoy? What can we do to improve? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, me too. I really enjoy chairing. So I always end up learning a lot. I come into the debate sometimes not having an opinion, or sometimes having a really strong opinion, and then by the end of it, I realized I'm not so sure anymore. I always end up with more questions than answers. So what did you learn? What did you enjoy? What can we do to improve? What did you learn? What did you enjoy?
I enjoyed Jesus in the tax code. But the thing that I learned was a part of that, I didn't realize the wordage was such, where he says specifically church and minister of the gospel. And it's like, wow, what do they do with people of other faith traditions and other facilities, institutions of other faith traditions? So that was very interesting.
I would like to have a definition, maybe this is late in the game, but what is a Christian nation?
I think one of the issues that I had was I don't like the resolution. Just like what you were saying, you have all of these words, how are you going to define nation or Christian or, is, even, which I love that. I think it was too broad, and one of the issues that I had was how do you prepare for something that the conversation could literally go 100 different ways because it was so wide open.
Yeah, some of the debates that I've chaired have a very specific resolution, and then some are very open-ended. And I have found that both can go their own directions in the sense that people really like to talk about the fine details with a specific resolution, but with a very broad, open one, it goes any direction. And I guess it's your preference whether you like it that way or not. But I have enjoyed at least that people can approach it in any way that they like, and so it brings more information to the table. So anyone else? What did you learn? What did you enjoy?
Just one more thing.
Yes.
The word Christian to me is more personal, and nation is not personal. And so the two conflict to a large degree, I think.
All right. And with that, I thank you all for your wonderful participation, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your night. Okay, how did I do?